meaningful work can be found in every job every day. And it's all about moments that matter. So if you are trying to make your experience of work more meaningful, find moments where you can connect with someone. Find moments where you think about the impact of the work that you're doing.
Hello and welcome to the Daily Helping with Dr. Richard Schuster. Food for the brain, knowledge from the experts, tools to win at life. I'm your host, Dr. Richard. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, and whatever you do, this is the show that is going to help you become the best version of yourself. Each episode, you will hear from some of the most amazing, talented, and successful people on the planet who followed their passions and strive to help others. Join our movement to get 1 million people each day to commit acts of kindness for others. Together, we're going to make the world a better place. Are you ready? Because it's time for your Daily Helping. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Daily Helping Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Richard, and we have two amazing people for the price of one today. I want to introduce you to my amazing guests. First, Wes Adams. He's the CEO of SV Consulting Group. He partners with Fortune 500 companies and other corporations scaling their businesses to develop high-impact leaders and design operating structures that support high-performing teams. He is also a positive psychology researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, where he studies the leadership practices and organizational structures that help employees thrive. Not to be outdone, Tamara Myles is a speaker, author, professor, and entrepreneur specializing in the science of human flourishing at work. She helps leaders in organizations like Microsoft, KPMG, and MassMutual unlock the power of meaningful work to drive peak performance, innovation, and resilience. A faculty member at Boston College and a researcher and instructor at the University of Pennsylvania, her work challenges assumptions about work, showing that when leaders make work more meaningful, they create thriving teams and lasting impact. Both of them are here with us today to talk about their book, Meaningful Work, a practical playbook based on decades of research and stories from leaders you already admire, from companies like Patagonia, HubSpot, Marriott, the Ritz-Carlton, Pinterest, and many others. Meaningful Work will show you how to take small actions each day to inspire passion and performance in every employee, and has drawn plays from luminaries such as Kenneth Cole, Arthur C. Brooks, and Adam Grant. No pressure, guys. There's a lot to live up to now. Welcome to the Daily Helping. It is awesome to have you both with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. So excited to be here.
Absolutely. So this is fun when I get to have multiple guests, because my favorite question that I like to learn, because people's why are so important. You guys know this. It doesn't matter which one of you leads off, but I want to kind of find out individually what puts you on the path you're on today, kind of your superhero origin story. And then I want to talk about how you guys came together to do the amazing work you're doing today.
So yeah, thanks again for having us on. And I think, what kind of brought me to this topic was, I guess, my own personal experience. I started more as an entrepreneur, launching and growing businesses. I spent about 10 years doing that. And then I was looking for something that was a little bit more meaningful to me. And I shifted into social enterprise and was working at a consulting company that worked with brands with social missions and large nonprofits. And I think naively, when I started that type of work, I assumed, because it's a mission-driven organization, or because I'm working with mission-driven organizations, they're going to be great places to work because everyone cares about the same thing. Everyone is, kind of aligned around this common purpose. And I was a little surprised to find that not all of these places were great places to work. In fact, some of them were definitely not great places to work. And at the same time, I was starting to work globally with people in different countries from different cultures who had very different expectations of work and different things that they wanted to get out of it. And so I became really interested in organizational design and organizational psychology and understanding, can you deconstruct what it takes to make a high-performing team, to figure out how to unlock people's best capabilities. And make work more meaningful to them. And that's what kind of led me to grad school to study this. That's where I met Tamara, and the rest is history.
And my story is, we ended up in the same place for kind of the same reasons, but started in from different starting points. So I started my career in advertising, fast-paced, creative industry. And I worked in workplaces that really felt meaningful. Like my job felt meaningful. I had leaders who pushed me and believed in me. And then I worked in other workplaces where it just felt like drudgery, right? I wasn't motivated. I was kind of bored, and I was doing kind of the same job in both. And I was curious about that experience. And after that, about 10 years in advertising, I started my own business, and I was developing models and consulting on productivity. That my first book is called The Secret to Peak Productivity, and I had developed a framework, and I was consulting with leaders and individuals on, how to set up your own personal systems for productivity, how to set up organizational systems where people can perform at their best. And what I was finding is that, the more you set up systems to help you be more productive, the more time you had to focus on what truly matters, right? Work that felt meaningful. But then the more time you spent on work that felt meaningful, the more productive you were. And so I was noticing this virtuous cycle in place. And that's when I decided to go back to school to understand the science behind that cycle, but also how can leaders unlock this at scale? How can we create organizations where this is happening at scale, where it felt like the first agency I worked with and not the other ones? And so that's where Wes and I met on the first day of graduate school, kind of by accident or serendipity, I guess. We ended up seated next to each other at dinner on that first night and kind of shared our stories, realized we were both there to study the same thing, and then the rest is history.
I love this. So it was a grad school meeting, and you were both studying positive psychology?
Yeah, we were at University of Pennsylvania in the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology program. And I think for those of your listeners who may not know what positive psychology is, if you think about traditional psychology as kind of focusing on roadblocks to our well-being, things like depression, anxiety, PTSD, what we think about as clinical psychology, super important work, right? Like very important to get those roadblocks out of the way and clear the path. But if we only focus on those things, that just gets us to neutral. Right. And positive psychology is the study of the mindsets, the behaviors, the practices that help us reach our full potential, that live our best lives, do our best work, pursue excellence. And so that's sort of the segment of practices that we focus on. And specifically, we work in organizations.
And that resonates so strongly with me, Wes. And thank you for that. That was going to be my next question. You beat me to the punch. For me as a clinical psychologist, you're right. I'm trained really principally in cognitive behavioral, theory, but I'm also a social worker, which was very strengths based, right? So if there was a psychological construct, a theory that I would say is the official psychological construct of what this show is all about, it would 100% be positive psychology. And I'd build a statue to Marty Seligman, the father of this discipline.
Who was heavily influenced by Aaron Beck, who founded cognitive behavioral psychology, also at University of Pennsylvania. So it's a very clear progression.
It's kind of like the circle of life, right?
It is.
But it's so important. Everybody who listens to this has heard me say for the past 9 years, this show's about being the best version of who you are and making the world a better place, doing good things for other people. That's really rooted in the soul of positive psychology. And I love what you guys are doing. Many, many years ago, I had on Bob Berg, who really was one of the seminal guys in the corporate space to say, hey, working for places where the mission matters is important. And nobody was talking about this 25, 30 years ago because it was all about bottom line, right? And now, particularly with millennials and Gen Z and these younger generations that are entering the workplace, they do want to work somewhere where they know that it's their contributions are doing good for mankind. And yet, to your point, Wes, what you said was really interesting. A lot of these organizations that are these kind of do good centric companies, well, they're not fun places to work. And whether you own a business or, whether you work for somebody else, everybody wants to be happy about where they're working, feel good about what they're doing. So now that we kind of know, how you guys met each other, talk to us about why you wrote Meaningful Work. And then we're going to dive into the meat of that book.
Sure. So we wrote Meaningful Work because we, in grad school ended up doing research on, as we were reading the literature, we discovered that most of the research on meaningful work was done exclusively from the individual perspective. How can I increase my own sense of meaning at work? But a huge missing piece was, what environment am I in? And what's the role of my colleagues, the leaders, in creating that environment? Because we suspected that no matter how much you do yourself, you can't fully get there alone. And so we did the first study that looked at these leadership behaviors and practices and the impact of that. And we actually found that the impact was much larger than we suspected. We found that leaders in the environment that we're in, are responsible for almost half of our experience of meaning at work. So 48%. And when we published that, it generated a lot of interest. People were excited about it. People were excited about our findings, about the specific practices. What can people actually do? And so we continued the research. We're still doing different stages of it. But we wrote the book because people were really hungry for this information, for this like practical playbook of, how do I do this if I'm interested in creating this environment?
Can I jump in also because you said, Dr. Richard, a couple of things. You said fun at work. You talked about purpose. You talked about happiness. We're talking about meaning. And I think it would be really great for us to step back and really define what we mean when we talk about meaning. What we found was that meaning at work comes from three main sources: community, contribution, and challenge. Community is that sense that you belong in your organization, that you can show up authentically, bring your full self and your full ideas to the table. Contribution is the understanding that your work matters to others, that you're having a positive impact, whether that's on larger company goals, whether you're positively impacting a customer or someone else in the community, or even just adding value to your colleagues. And finally, challenge is the individual opportunity to learn and grow. Are you being stretched? Are you developing your capabilities? And all three of those things kind of weave together to create meaningful work. And there's a multiplier effect there. And I think one of the things we learned was that also if one of them is missing, it can cancel out the other two, which sort of explains that experience that I had at a mission-driven organization, that didn't necessarily feel super meaningful because some of the, the community aspects were missing or the contribution aspects were missing.
I just want to also jump in and say, you mentioned like people really drawn to purpose and mission-driven work, right? And that started like 20, 30 years ago. And, we got Simon Sinek and Start With Why. And what we found is, of course, that's very important work to define your mission. But what we found is that like having a stated mission or a big grand purpose is really important, especially to attract talent that cares about that mission, that wants to do that kind of good in the world, whatever it is that your mission is. But it's not enough to make work meaningful. It's great to get the right people in the door, but what really turns that purpose into meaning is understanding how you are contributing to that purpose every day. It's the impact that you're making. So once you start working at the company and the purpose kind of brought you in, what really matters is your experience of work, right? What makes meaningful work is less about what you do and much more about how you experience what you do.
I love this. Wes, you had mentioned, these three things that you found: the community, the contribution. Do people feel challenged? And you said that if one isn't present, it can cancel out the other two. But in quantifying that research, did you determine that, was like community 42% and, contribution was 38%? Like, was there a breakdown as to how valuable these things are kind of in comparison to each other?
Well, I think one of the things that we learned is some of those things might be more important to certain people or certain groups of people, depending on your background, why you chose a job, all of those sorts of things. For example, folks who are earlier in their career are probably interested more in challenge, right? They want to learn and grow and develop and expand their skills. And if you're a leader in an organization and managing people like that, or a colleague to someone like that, helping them find that might be a little bit more important. Whereas if you're coming to the end of your career, your contribution, your legacy might be something more important to you. And so I think it really ranges. There are individual differences, of course, but we found that all three were important across the board. And I think that another thing that is worth mentioning is that, you don't have to have a mission-driven job to find meaning in your work. We've studied, we've interviewed people all across the board, from janitors and hairstylists to software developers to corporate executives, people that run their own businesses. And what we learned was that your job doesn't have to be your life's calling for your work to feel worthwhile. You can find a lot of meaning in any of those jobs if you know where to look.
And even outside of that, I've had episodes where, we were really talking about purpose, and maybe you really love animals, but you work as an actuary. It doesn't mean that, you have to quit your job and become a vet technician. You can
Right.
volunteer at a pound a couple of days a month and get that part of your, fulfillment that you need, and still, find meaning in your work. So I love that you're saying that. So Tamara, you've mentioned it. I read it in the intro here, that meaningful work is a practical playbook, which I love, because that means that there's things that people can actually do and put into action, rather than just this whole thing be theoretical, although I know it's based on research and science. So if somebody picks up this book at a Barnes and Nobles today and they want to get started making changes so that either environment for their employees is more meaningful or enjoyable, or they want to implement it in their own small business or even in their home, like, what are some of the things? I know we can't talk about everything in the book, but talk about a few of the things that you guys really love that would be a great place for people to start.
Sure. So I'll start with community. What we found in our study, the question that predicted the highest sense of community for people was, my leader cares about what's happening in my life outside of work, right? And notice that it's not knows, but cares about. And so what does that mean every day? Well, what we find is that leaders, colleagues, when we talk about leaders, we're talking broadly about influence. So you don't have to be a people manager to lead. You can be a colleague or somebody who cares, right? That's all that it means here, really, in this community. And so work has become really transactional, especially since we have gone hybrid. Many times we're just meeting in a Zoom or exchanging emails and getting right to the point. And we're losing a little bit of that human touch, the human connection. And so to increase a sense of community, ask people like, well, hey, what's going on in your personal life? Like, what'd you do this weekend? And then really listen, take the time to care, and then remember and say, oh, hey, Dr. Richard, you mentioned you were going to play golf with your kids this weekend. How was that? Like, did you have fun? Did you whatever? And did you guys go out to eat after? And tell me about that. And you start building those connections individually. And another way to do that is in a meeting, whether it's on Zoom or in person. Give someone the spotlight for the first 5 minutes of the meeting. Have somebody bring in an object or a picture, something that's meaningful to them, and tell the story about that object. Tell the story about that picture. And what happens is everybody that's in that room or in that Zoom will start kind of seeing layers of that person that they didn't know. And maybe it's a picture of their garden, and they're talking about how beautiful their hydrangeas are this summer and their roses or whatever. And then maybe what happens is Wes says, oh, I love to garden too, or my mom garden. And all of a sudden you have connections between people that are organically formed. And that's really, really important to strengthen the sense of community.
I love that. I know, Wes, you've got something to add.
Well, I was going to jump in actually with an example of contribution. And Dr. Richard, you and I are both Atlanta based, and so are very familiar with Calendly, which is an Atlanta based company. And probably a lot of us are at scheduling software, right? Like I send you a link so you can schedule a meeting with me. Probably one of the most transactional pieces of software I could think of, right? And the CEO, Tope Awantona, does an incredible job of telling the story of how this actually positively impacts customers, right? So they don't think of Calendly as like scheduling software. They think about it as a way to save people time, right? And they've quantified it. They say like Calendly saves you like an hour a week going back and forth on email scheduling, right? And that's an hour you get to do maybe more meaningful work, to spend time with your family over the course of a year. That probably adds up to more than, a week's worth of time, right? That's pretty significant. And so one of the things that Tope does when he's talking to customers is ask them, like, what are you doing with that time? How has this, benefited you? And then he hears that story, and then he'll record a video telling that story about how Calendly has positively impacted a customer and send that to the whole company, right? And so that means that, if you're a software developer, if you're working on the iPhone app and you're, sitting at home and you're coding by yourself most of the time and never interacting with the customer, you're getting to understand how your work is kind of laddering up to this larger purpose, right? You're able to see that clear line of sight between your work and the impact that it's having on others. And that is a way to really create a sense of impact and contribution among employees. And so just telling that story is a really powerful way to create meaning.
The challenge piece is interesting to me because there's data that I know is out there that says, and we've seen this, HR talks about this, that it used to be many, many years ago, you'd go get a job somewhere and you'd stay at that job for 10, 15, 20 years. And that world is long gone. Now people, switch jobs like, different Uber drivers, right? Like and so part of the reason why we saw this first with millennials and this trend seemingly has continued is that there's a lower frustration tolerance for superiors to where if a line is crossed, and that line could just be, I want you to work till 6:00 p.m. tonight on a Friday, versus whatever it is. Like there tends to be this low frustration tolerance in younger workers, and the data bears this out, which is part of the reason why there isn't a real sense of loyalty to the degree there used to be in the corporate world to now people kind of have this more of a mercenary attitude. I think that's the best way to describe it, jumping job to job. So when I hear that your data has borne out that one of the most critical things for employees is that they feel challenged, it makes me wonder about that in that, not that I'm not saying that's true, but it makes me wonder, are people using this kind of mercenary attitude to say, no, screw these guys, I'm leaving this company, I'm going to another job? Is that more a product of the fact that community or contribution isn't part of their equation? Or is there this weird dichotomous kind of relationship about wanting to be challenged, but if they're challenged in a way that a red line for them is crossed, they're going to flip up two middle fingers and quit their job? So what's your guys' take on that?
Well, there's a really interesting nuance in our finding about challenge, that you have to challenge people and provide them opportunities for learning and developing. But equally as important as the high challenge is the high support. Challenge without support is a recipe for anxiety, for fear, for, feeling stressed and burning out. We didn't parse the data for turnover, correlating it with each of the C. So we don't know exactly like the answer to your question, like are people leaving because of which seat? But like Wes said earlier, like each C holds different importance. This is where the individual differences come in, right? For each individual and each career stage and all of that. So my guess would be that different people leave organizations for different reasons. But if we want to zoom in on challenge, we all need someone who believes in us. When we ask in our workshops or in our study, when we ask, think about someone who had a positive influence in your life. And maybe your listeners can do that with us now. Like pause for a moment and think about someone who had a significant positive influence in your life. And it could be a leader, a mentor, a coach, a parent, a family member, a colleague. What is it that this person did? What are the actions? Why did they have a positive influence? Very, very often, people tell us really amazing stories about someone who believed in them, someone who saw potential in them and gave them opportunities or pushed them to learn and grow, places where they didn't even think they were ready, or strengths that they didn't even see in themselves, but that person helped them develop those strengths, gave them those opportunities. And that is really important, is like seeing, you talked about being strengths-based with your social work, right? So seeing strengths in people, highlighting those strengths, giving them opportunity to use those strengths, providing the support they need, whether that is mentorship, learning, classes, resources internally, connecting them with the right people. That really, really unlocks a sense of lasting meaning and growth when someone believes in us.
I love that. Wes, anything you'd like to piggyback off of?
Yeah, I mean, I think just going back to your original question, I think there is a lot of data. I think, I've seen studies from McKinsey and other folks showing that people leave jobs when they don't believe there's a path forward for them, right? If I don't have a path to growth here, if I can't see how I'm going to move to the next stage, I'm going to move on. So I have an opportunity to do that. And one of the things we looked at in the research, in addition to burnout, is this idea of bore out. Like if I'm doing the same thing over and over again without a way to move forward, I get bored and I don't feel challenged. And that leads me to start to disengage, to maybe look for another job, that sort of thing. And so I think that's important. And now I'm talking from my personal experience and not the research, but I would say, as we're engaging with younger employees, people who are newer to the workforce, one of the most important things is to be intentional and explicit about the fact that I want to help you learn and grow. And so I'm going to give you a stretch assignment, or I'm going to challenge you to do this because I think it's going to benefit your career and I want to help you get there, right? If I just throw you a difficult piece of work and I'm like, go figure this out, and it's not clear to the employee how it's benefiting the company, how it's benefiting their own development, that can be very not challenging in the good way, but it can be very frustrating or cause anxiety. And so what we want is that productive challenge. We want to be stretched, but we want to see that it's potentially going to benefit our own development and that we have the support to get there.
I love this. Absolutely love this. This has been such a great conversation. What you guys are doing is so important because, listen, people should be able to go to a job, feel that they're being valued, feel that they're growing, and feel that what they're doing is making a positive contribution to society. So thank you both for writing meaningful work and for the work that you're individually doing out in the world. As you know, so this is for both of you. You both get to answer. I wrap up every episode by asking my guests just this one question, and that is, what is your biggest helping, that one most important piece of information you'd like somebody to walk away with after hearing our conversation today?
Well, I would say, sometimes meaning and meaningful work can feel really abstract, right? You think it's like this big, hard thing, theoretical thing. And what I would say the biggest helping for me is that meaningful work can be found in every job every day. And it's all about moments that matter. So if you are trying to make your experience of work more meaningful, find moments where you can connect with someone. Find moments where you think about the impact of the work that you're doing. Who did your work help today? And then find moments where you're learning and being challenged and growing. Community contribution and challenge can be found in moments every day.
I love that. Wes, take us home.
I 100% agree with what Tamara said. And, there are so many of the ways that you can create those small moments for people that we talk about in the book. The one I think that's had the biggest impact on me and that I find myself using much more since writing this is just saying thank you, right? Just acknowledging people for the work that they're doing and telling them that it matters to you is so important. And There's research from Gallup and WorkHuman that showed that one thank you once a week was enough to cut disengagement and burnout in half. One thank you once a week from a manager, right? And less than 40% of people in that study felt adequately recognized, right? This is so small, it's so easy, and we forget to do it all the time, right? And in my life, whenever I go anywhere, whether it's the grocery store to get a cup of coffee, whether I'm, working with, colleagues on a consulting project, I've made a real effort to say thank you to people and to acknowledge the work that they're doing and why it's mattered. And I think that's an opportunity to create a meaningful moment for them, but it also feels really good for me to say that out loud and to let them know, why their work matters. And so I think it's a real win-win and something that's just so easy to do.
I love that, Wes. Awesome. The book is called Meaningful Work, which is available everywhere books are sold. But for those of us listening, people want to find out more about each of you guys. Where can we find out more about you online?
So we are both very active on LinkedIn, Instagram. We share tips and ideas and, ongoing research. So we'd love to connect there. And then we have a website called makeworkmeaningful.com. You can go there to take our free meaning-driven leadership assessment and then download free resources that are from our book.
Beautiful. And for those of you in the car, we got you covered. Everything about meaningful work will be linked in the show notes at drrichardschuster.com. Well, guys, thank you both for joining us today. I love the conversation and keep doing the meaningful work you guys are doing. No pun. Pun intended.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And to those of you sitting at home, thank you for tuning to this episode. Despite my corny joke, if you learned something, if you liked what you heard today, go give us a follow and a 5-star review on your podcast app of choice, because this is what helps other people find the show. But most importantly, go out there today and do something nice for somebody else, even if you don't know who they are, and post in your social media feeds using the hashtag #MyDailyHelping, because the happiest people are those that help others.